just listen to the Republicans.
Well, let's try to hear what happened.
Exercise, it's for Article 1.
Welcome to Lecture 10.1. Today we're going to talk about Senate procedure. This will be a consolidation of what we'd hoped to talk about across 2 lectures. I think we're going to be able to cover it all in one video. That's going to make for a long video since we're also breaking down the election in this video. I apologize for that. There's a lot to talk about across the board. Senate procedure is really organized around the fact that the Senate, especially when compared to the House, is like the Wild West. And you can tell this because when you look at senators, they are a group of rough and tumble, rough around the edges folks, right? You can see it in their faces. It's the Wild West because the Senate has fewer constraints on what it is that individual senators can do. When you think about videos, the last couple of videos about the House procedure, we looked at that chart that walks through how it is that bills progress towards becoming a law in the House and Senate. In the House, there's this big step of having a rules committee that very clearly delineates what it is that legislators can and can't do. In the Senate, no such procedure, no such step or hurdle exists. And because no process for sort of locking down the procedures of the Senate exists, it's basically anything goes. So these guys look, nice in their seersucker suits, but they're really rough and tumble and willing to play ball in order to get what it is that they want. And that has been increasingly the case over the course of the last 20, 30 years, where the Senate has become even more wild and more crazy. All right, so how is it then that senators impose order on the Senate in order to get anything done? So it's not total chaos, but the way that they manage chaos is going to be very different than what they do in the House, where they have a rules committee that can basically rein all of this in. So one of the things that's different and one of the sources of this Wild West action is what's called the germaneness requirement. What does that mean? Well, a germaneness requirement is that and there is no germaneness requirement in the Senate. That means that any senator can offer an amendment on any topic to any bill. That is, amendments to bills in the Senate do not need to be germane to the topic of the bill. If I was in the House, this would be different. There is no germaneness requirement in the Senate, but there is one in the House. So in the House, if the bill comes to the floor and say it's an open rule, so any amendment is in order, and it's a bill about post offices, and I have this thing that I want to do with salmon fisheries in the Pacific Northwest. I've got a bill about salmon fisheries. There's a bill about the post office on the floor. I'm like, I just really want, I want this policy in place. So I stand up and I say, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment that amends this bill on post offices, but it really deals with salmon fisheries. Someone could stand up and say, Mr. Speaker, the gentleman's amendment is not germane to the topic of the bill. So we raise a point of order, and the chair, the speaker, whoever it is that's making this decision, would say, that's right, it's against House rules to have non-germane amendments. No such requirement exists in the Senate. So think about the opportunities that arise then. If I'm from the Pacific Northwest and I care a lot about salmon fisheries because my constituents like salmon fisheries, if I'm that person, I can offer amendments to any bill with basically the language of my legislation on salmon fisheries, and it will get attached to that bill in interesting ways. So in practice, any legislation may be added as an amendment to another bill. And that happens on a regular basis. So what does that do? It undermines the power of committees because I don't need to discharge bills from committee. I don't need to introduce this as a bill and wait for it to come down through and get a rule. If a committee's not doing what I want to do with my bill on salmon fisheries, I just rewrite it, relabel it an amendment, and try and add it to somebody else's bill on something that's totally unrelated. There's also the possibility of strategic amendments within the Senate. So there's this notion of precedence where we go through that amendment tree. We have first degree amendments, second degree amendments, first degree perfecting amendments, second degree perfecting amendments. Those amendments have to be considered in a particular order. And if we fill up that amendment tree, so I fill it up in particular ways with amendments that I know won't pass, it makes it impossible for other people to offer amendments to the same legislation. So I can lock down a bill and the content of a bill if I can stand up and say, well, here's this bill. I'm going to offer all of these amendments, because it turns out that first degree amendments, so an amendment to the text of legislation, that's in order. A second degree amendment, an amendment to an amendment, is in order. A third degree amendment, which would be an amendment to an amendment to an amendment, is not in order in the Senate. So if someone offered a third degree amendment after a series of amendments had been offered to a bill, someone could stand up and say, in the Senate, Mr. President, the amendment offered by the gentleman is a third degree amendment and is not in order and is therefore not in order. I wanted to raise that point of order. And the Senate president would say, or the person who's presiding in the Senate at that moment would uphold that point of order and would rule that you wouldn't be able to offer that amendment. So one way that we impose some order is through these strategic amendments and filling out this amendment tree. So there's also this idea of killer amendments, sometimes called November amendments. And that is that when you see a bill that you don't like, you might step in and offer an amendment to that bill that will pass, that people will like the amendment, but what that will do is it will somehow change the legislation, the underlying legislation, in a way that will make it unpalatable for final passage. You can see how this is perhaps problematic, because it turns out that senators are smart. They can look at what's going on and they can say, well, wait, I see what you're doing here. And they'll say no. So even though there is a lot of talk about killer amendments in some circles, there's very little evidence that killer amendments actually happen inside the Senate. The other thing that offering amendments does is it creates additional costs on the way that legislation happens in the Senate. So if you want to slow things down, if you want to create problems for the majority and you're in the minority, one thing you could do is just offer a whole bunch of amendments to legislation over and over and over and over again. And if you do that, then it's going to force roll call votes, not just on the amendment itself, but the passage of an amendment is something that's subject to debate. We'll talk about this in a little more detail in a second, but if it's subject to debate in the Senate, that means it is subject to potentially to a gerrymander. And that can really slow some things down. The other thing to realize is, even though things are subject to debate and a filibuster, to end the debate is a vote, and people don't often understand the distinction between voting to end debate and voting at final passage. So Lisa Murkowski played this funny game, not on policy, but when Coney Barrett a nomination came to the floor, she voted against cloture, against ending debate on her nomination, but then turned around and voted for her to get confirmed. It was a bit of a disingenuous move. She's like, look, I think this process is wrong, but now that the process has been completed, I think she's actually okay on the Senate. Or on the Supreme Court. People try and play this game where they use amendments to offer some sort of political cover for folks. By and large, because anybody can offer amendments at any time and on any subject, and people can drag out debate for long periods of time, this Wild West notion is something that requires some people just to agree not to do it. We all just have to look around and say, look, we're going to let each other do our thing, because if we don't, no one's going to get anything done. The formal mechanism by which this happens is called a unanimous consent agreement. And unanimous consent agreements dispenses with what are called regular order, which is just this Wild West, everybody amends all the time and nothing ever nothing happens. It has the distinction of having to be adopted by all senators. So in the title of this procedure is unanimous. You need everyone to agree to it. If there is any objection, it unravels the whole thing. So there will be no unanimous consent agreement. The proper way to think about this is that it's more or less equivalent to a rule in the House. In the same way that a rule in the House sets the parameters for the debate, it identifies the amendments that are going to be in order, and it identifies potentially the order by which those amendments are going to be in order. It might also schedule a time for a vote. So all of these are things that rules do, and unanimous consent agreements serve the same purpose. They sort of constrain and limit the way that debate happens. It has the significant difference of requiring that all senators agree to them. In the House, rules are passed with a majority vote. In the Senate, unanimous consent agreements only come about if every senator agrees to them. So that suggests a really important role for party leaders. In fact, staff do most of the legwork, but this is a negotiation in these days between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, where they sit down and hash out how these unanimous consent agreements work. They communicate that back to their respective conferences and caucuses. They talk about what's going to happen, and they sit down and say, look, this is what we can agree to, and this is how we can be sure to avoid any member of the Senate objecting. And because the majority and minority leader are given particular powers, they do have some leverage over legislators who would otherwise object to get them on board to agree to these unanimous consent agreements. But mostly the way to think about this is, because it's the Wild West, it's anarchy, any single senator has a significant amount of power in the way that he or she can disrupt and stop the legislative process. They don't have an outright veto, but they have a sort of a weaker version of something like a veto, where they can slow things down and make it really painful to get any legislation passed through the Senate. Once legislation has a unanimous consent agreement or arrives on the floor, then action on the floor in the Senate is really important. There's several things that can happen on the floor that are notable and that you should know about taking a class on congressional procedure. So think about what a typical floor process looks like. Typical is in quotes here, because there's really no such thing as a typical floor process in the Senate. So number one, the majority leader obtains a UCA. So he gets a unanimous consent agreement, he gets the minority leader to agree to it. Everyone's on board. We get this UCA. Number two, the presiding officer will recognize the majority leader. The majority leader, the basis of his or her power is that the majority leader gets to be recognized first. They have the right of first recognition before any other senator. Why is that important? Well, think about that amendment tree. So suppose you have a UCA, you can stand up and say, we've got a UCA, we're going to move forward on this UCA. That's all negotiated ahead of time. Suppose someone objects to that UCA. Then the Senate majority leader gets to stand up and say, Mr. President, we've got a whole bunch of things that we need to get done today, including this bill. And before we move forward on the bill, since you've recognized me first, I want to offer 4 amendments. I want to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. I want to offer a perfecting amendment to the nature of a substitute, a second degree amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute. Now that's curious, right? Amendments in the nature of a substitute replace all of the language of the bill. And the majority leader could replace the language once, replace the language twice. Now, those are amendments he knows will definitely fail. But now there's no opportunity to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute because we filled the tree as it applies to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Then he can offer a series of perfecting amendments. And because he's the first person recognized and there's no limit to the amendments he can offer first and second degree perfecting amendments as well. This is called filling the amendment tree. And it basically says, look, here are the amendments that we're going to consider. They're the only amendments we're going to consider. And that closes down because he's recognized first and they consider those amendments. They have to consider those amendments because that's how the Senate works. It locks down the type of action that might be taken on any bill in the Senate. That's a lot of power, right? So once the presiding officer is recognized, amendments are in order. And if the presiding officer wants to be strategic about it, he can fill things up. And one of the things he can do is he can pick and choose his colleagues' amendments and offer those in the amendment tree and then lock it down by filling out the rest of the amendment tree so only those amendments are considered. Finally, there's a roll call. And to compress all of this into one bullet point is tough because there's usually a roll call on whether or not there's going to be a roll call. But in practice, just so you know, roll calls happen in alphabetical order, which is really interesting, where the clerk calls the names of all the senators. This is in contrast to what happens in the Senate. And some of my research has looked at what the effects of this process of calling roll versus having what happens in the House take place. So in the Senate, they go A to Z, all of the senators' names in order. They call them out, and they can cast their vote when their name is called out. In the House, on the other hand, they cast their votes simultaneously. And there's literally a huge scoreboard that they project on the wall that says how each senator is voting, or excuse me, each member of the House is voting on any particular piece of legislation. You get a green dot if you vote yes, you get a red dot if you vote no, and you get a yellow dot if you vote present. One of the things that happens, we know this happens, is people don't know how to vote when they show up. They don't know if they should vote yes or if they should vote no. That could happen for a few reasons. It could happen because they don't know what the bill is about. They don't know if it's a good bill or a bad bill. So they show up and they look around and they're like, what are people that I trust doing on this particular piece of legislation? I'm going to vote the way that they vote. If they like it, then I'm going to vote for it. If they don't like it, then I'm going to vote against it. I guess it could also work in the same way for people you don't trust. So if you're very conservative and you know that a liberal is voting against it, you're like, I should probably vote for this. And if you're very liberal and a conservative does the same, vice versa, you know what to do. So there's lots of ways to read these signals. The difference between the House and the Senate is the order by which those signals are offered. In the Senate, they can only be offered in alphabetical order. So the people who vote early have less information about what's going to happen than the people who vote later. And because we know that that's the case, as the roll call proceeds, the dynamics should change. I've shown that to be the case in research that I published in the American Economic Review. The contrast is what happens in the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, there's this scoreboard. And so you walk in and there's a few people that will vote early, and you kind of go through the list and you're like, there's my buddy. I'm going to vote the way my buddy wants me to vote. But there are also examples of legislators who are on the fence, and they know they could vote with one group and satisfy, say, their party, or they could vote against their party and satisfy their constituents. And so there are these stories about members of the House who kind of sit back in the corner and watch and see who it is that they want to please. So if their vote is going to matter, they might vote with their party. So if it's a really close vote, they might sacrifice their constituency interests and get what their party wants. On the other hand, if the vote is lopsided and their party doesn't need their vote, they're free to just go vote in the way that a single-minded seeker of re-election might and vote with their constituency. So we expect these dynamics to shift depending on how the vote unfolds. And it's interesting that there are these mechanisms in place that allow for this kind of coordination among senators. We call the roll publicly. They don't cast their votes in a ballot secretly. They always broadcast them because that allows for legislators to think about and coordinate what it is that they're doing. And roll calls, this very public way of casting votes, is meant to be a mechanism by which senators can look around and say, what is it that I need to do to help my party, to help my constituency, and how do I make those trade-offs based on what everybody else is doing? All right, so let's think about ways that this can get disrupted. This is how it works usually. We can move smoothly from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, but it turns out there are lots of ways to kill bills in the Senate. Good movies too. So number 1, holds. Can offer holds. Can filibuster. And this is related to filibustering, but we have this process of possibly unraveling these ways of killing bills called cloture. So let's talk about all three of these in turn, starting off with holds. A hold is a request to delay the scheduling of a bill, and it's just that. It's a request. I approach the Senate Majority Leader. It's a piece of legislation that affects my state or affects my constituents. Say, look, I need you to just hold off. We need to figure out more information. We take that bill, we set it aside, we just don't schedule action on it. Because the Senate Majority Leader has the right of first recognition, he's also the person who gets to set the agenda for the day. He gets to say, what is it that we're going to consider? Let's propose alternatives to the status quo. He's the one that controls which alternatives to the status quo are considered. So he has this powerful agenda-setting power. And if you can persuade him that he should use it to your advantage by holding a bill from moving forward, you can get the Senate Majority Leader to effectively kill the bill on your behalf. Any senator can request a hold. So any senator effectively has the ability to kill legislation. That again, it's this Wild West. Ultimately, though, the Majority Leader decides whether or not to honor that request. And the reason why he might honor the request is because he recognizes that if he doesn't, you might filibuster. Or you might object to the UCA and make this whole process really complicated, open up all sorts of really gnarly scenarios. So the filibuster is really the filibuster. The implicit threat of a filibuster becomes really important. And it's not just that we see people filibustering, it's that the Majority Leader understands that if they filibuster, if we do something these people don't like, they're going to filibuster. So just because we don't see filibusters all the time doesn't mean that filibusters aren't important. It's a theme of this class, that power isn't always something that we observe directly. We have to think about how we might observe it indirectly, because if you have to insist that you're powerful, you're probably not. Talking about the filibuster, we have to think about this guy, Aaron Burr, who was the president of the Senate because he was the vice president to Thomas Jefferson. He was vice president when he shot Alexander Hamilton and established himself as a villain in the history of American politics. Another reason why we might think of him as problematic is Aaron Burr in the early 1800s looked around and he said, we're all folks that can agree. We're colleagues, and we're all honorable gentlemen, bunch of white dudes. It makes sense that if any of us want to continue debate, we'll continue debate. And so he eliminated this motion as president of the Senate. When he presided over the Senate, he established the tradition of eliminating the motion to consider the previous question. So he made it so that it was never in order to hold a vote, to end debate, to cut things off. So Aaron Burr sets the stage for really, this idea that goes down in history as being maybe the defining feature. And I would dispute that, but because I think the defining feature of the Senate is really that it's this Wild West environment. But the filibuster, in some ways, kind of constrains that Wild West environment, right? And so in the early 1800s, Burr and senators agree to this unanimous consent to end debate, that everybody has to agree to it. By 1917, that's unpopular. They pass Rule 22, ends debate with the consent of 2/3 of senators. It's revised in 1974 to 3/5. 3/5 of 100 is 60. That's why you need 60 senators to pass any legislation. And for a long time, you needed 60 senators to confirm any presidential appointment. Except now we've changed this. So there's no filibuster on judicial appointees. There's no filibuster on presidential nominees. And there's no filibuster on Supreme Court of the United States nominees. That has all changed in the last 10 or 15 years. It's a question about whether or not the filibuster would survive if Joe Biden wins the presidency and Democrats take control of the Senate. They might want to get rid of it. A really interesting dynamic is that we might end up with a Democratic president and a Republican Senate, which will oppose Democratic nominees for things like ambassadorships, for heads of agencies and departments. There's going to be this really interesting dynamic if Mitch McConnell is the majority leader and Joe Biden is the president. Now, recognize Joe Biden is a senator. He'd served in the Senate for years and years. He knows it inside and out. But not controlling, this has only happened for a very brief period of time where the Senate and the presidency have not been aligned. Usually the House will be the one that's out of line with the presidency, and the Senate, which has similar electoral dynamics to what we see in the presidency, the Senate is usually aligned with the presidency. This has happened, I think, only once in the last 100 years or so, and it was in the early 2000s. And then it was only because Democrats got a boost when Jim Jeffers, a Republican from New England, switched his party from Republican to Independent to Democrat, and gave control of the Senate to Democrats. We'll see. We got to see how these races shake down. In popular imagination, we think of the filibuster as being something like you see in the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. If you've never watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, you ought to. It is a great Jimmy Stewart movie. It's the second best Jimmy Stewart movie after It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart is an idealistic young senator appointed to represent his state, who comes to Washington and encounters deep and pervasive corruption, stands up to that corruption in a dramatic filibuster on the floor of the Senate. He holds the Senate because he speaks. He goes on and on and on until he finally collapses. And, his idol, who it turns out was corrupt, is so moved by this that he changes his ways and he fixes politics in America for a generation. Well, this is an inspiring movie. And this is a very dramatic scene. It turns out that most filibusters don't work that way. They work something like this, where you've got the majority leader and you've got a senator who approaches him and says, look, if you move forward with something, then I'm going to filibuster. Now, this is unusual here because you've got Ted Cruz, who's a Republican, speaking to a Republican majority leader. But it turns out that Ted Cruz has filibustered in an era of Republican dominance in the Senate. On the other hand, what's typically the case is you get a minority senator talking to the majority leader saying, look, I know you've got a majority of votes for this particular thing, but if you move forward with this legislation, then I and a few of my friends are going to filibuster this and keep it from moving forward. And that's enough for the majority leader just to say, look, okay, then we're not going to bring it up. We're just going to work on some other things. And that the filibuster threats, which are largely unseen and really hard to keep track of, end up being really, really important in figuring out what kind of legislation gets passed and what doesn't. So in practice, filibusters begin when there's a communication from a senator to the majority leader. The majority leader keeps the bill off the schedule. That should be off the schedule, not of the schedule. It allows progress on non-filibustered bills. So we have what's called a track system in the Senate right now, where there are multiple tracks. You have, like if you were in a rail yard, you've got multiple trains that are moving on this track. And when one of those trains stops, you can have it diverted onto a side track so that the main line stays open. We don't stop all traffic through this rail yard. And so the current filibuster system allows for that if you're going to filibuster it, it just gets moved onto a side track. It doesn't move forward until we can figure out a way to get it back on the main track and passed. People argue, though, that this lowers the cost of filibustering. It makes it easier for people to do it and makes it more widespread. And the people who are most likely to complain about this are people who are in the majority. So people in the majority want the minority to stop filibustering and let them get some things done. People in the minority don't tend to complain about this. But overall, what it allows it to happen is it says, look, you can stop legislation on one thing, but we're going to continue to consider other legislation. If we changed that and made the Senate just one track, so you had to consider everything in sequence, then it would raise the cost of a filibuster because you would have to stand and block a piece of legislation to the exclusion of all other legislation, including some bills that you might like. And so if the bills that you like aren't making progress, you're not going to be happy about that either. And you've got to make that trade-off then. Am I willing to let this go on this particular bill and let it go to a vote and potentially pass in order to get the Senate to move on to something that I like? It also requires senators to kind of actually stand up and publicly declare that they're filibustering something, whereas now a lot of that happens behind closed doors. So because it happens behind closed doors, it's not always clear who's filibustering. It's not always clear who it is that's made this threat, that's forced the majority leader to stop progress on things. It's always under threat. This is something that's really, it's both popular and unpopular depending on what situation you find yourself in. So if Republicans had lost the Senate, and still not clear, they may have, if Republicans lose the Senate and Democrats are in charge, they really like the filibuster. Whereas when the tables are turned and you've got a Republican president and a Republican majority in the Senate, they don't like the filibuster. So depending on where you are, you may or may not like the filibuster. The other thing to bear in mind is that filibusters aren't just on a particular bill. There's lots of ways to disguise filibuster action on killing things. So there are multiple phases of debate on any particular bill, and you've got to end the debate on each of those phases. So for example, you've got debate on the motion to proceed to consider a particular bill, but you also have debates that are focused on the actual final action on a bill. And you can filibuster both of those. But if I'm filibustering the motion to proceed, that has less of a resonance in a campaign commercial than if I stand up and oppose the actual legislation. So suppose it's something that's relatively popular, say raising the minimum wage, which is popular among Democrats, overwhelmingly popular among Democrats, and it's overwhelmingly popular among Republicans, except most Republican senators don't like it for a set of reasons. Set those aside. They don't like it. They don't want it to come to the floor for a vote. They want to block it. But opposing the bill itself is really unsavory. But you have the opportunity to oppose raising the minimum wage by blocking the motion to proceed. And it doesn't, if you're running against a Republican who's voted, who's filibustered the motion to proceed, those campaign ads like, he stood in the way of a motion to proceed to consider this, that, or the other. That doesn't sound the same as he blocked the raising of the minimum wage for working class people in our state. Those two messages resonate differently. And that's important to point out. All right, final votes. Final votes are where we talked a little bit about roll call votes at the end. We're in the last phases of this now. This final votes in the Senate. Things to bear in mind. So they call the roll and then they announce the vote. Once the vote is announced, there's no changing of your vote. It's fixed in place. Before that, you can change your vote in any number of ways. You can change it to yes, you can change it to no, you can move it around. So one of the things that will happen is the vote will be taken, and then there will be some negotiation. And the majority leader or whoever it is that's in charge can hold the vote open for an indefinite period of time, allowing people to change their votes and negotiate for different concessions. So that vote changing period allows for some leverage from senators who say, I'll vote no now, but if you give me what I want on something else or assure me that you'll give me what I want on something else, then I might change my vote to yes. The vote is always cast in alphabetical order. In practice, once your name has been called, you can vote anytime. So they'll come into the room and they'll signal, and they usually do it with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. They get the attention of the clerk, and once they see them, they say, look, I want to vote yes for this. They mark them as yes. But you can't vote. You're not allowed to vote until your name has been called. So senators, these votes are usually held open for a period of time, 15 or 20 minutes. They'll make their way to the floor, and if they get there late, they know their name has been called at least once, so they can vote. But if you're really keen on being the person who's there early, you can be, and you can make sure that your vote is cast early. And we see those effects. So I've done analysis of this, that people who vote early vote differently than people who vote late. And one of the things that happens is over the course of your career, your position in the roll call will change with time because you get more people with A's in their names or fewer people with A's in their names, and you move up and down in the order. In the House, you're casting votes simultaneously. We talked about that. The motion to reconsider is something that the winning side offers and tables. So there is always the second bite at the apple that is in order in both places. What will happen is someone will stand up immediately after the vote is taken and say, Mr. Speaker, I move to reconsider this vote. And then once they're recognized and that motion has been made, then they stand up immediately again and say, I move that we table this motion to reconsider, and then it's done. There's always going to be this opportunity for the second bite at the apple. That's just a quirk. So you'll see roll calls happen, and then you'll see this funny song and dance right afterwards where they stand up and they go through this motion to reconsider and this motion to table it. That's the case in the House and the Senate, except in the Senate where supermajority is required. So cloture or veto overrides, constitutional amendments in both the House and the Senate, veto overrides in the House and the Senate. All right, so we've got this process laid out in the Senate. The Senate is the Wild West. The Senate is a place that's supermajoritarian because you basically, there's all these places and all these ways that you need every senator on board, or you need an overwhelming proportion of senators on board. And then in this final passage process, we see these different dynamics across the House and the Senate. There's really a study in contrast between these two institutions. The House is this very regimented, efficient body. The Senate is the Wild West. Okay, this was a quick and dirty tour through the way that the Senate conducts itself. We covered the ways that the Senate is like the Wild West, where every senator is acting in his or her best interest. Sometimes that best interest and those actions put them at odds with the rest of the chamber. There are also ways to lock that down, but they're complicated and problematic compared to what the House can do. And then we also explored ways that the Senate ends up being supermajoritarian. So, I mean, the Wild West nature of it implies that it's supermajoritarian because you need everybody to go along with things. But the filibuster and the cloture process really create a system for limiting the undue influence of individual senators. Something to bear in mind here when we're thinking about how these two institutions work. A lot of the process for streamlining procedure in the House runs through the majority party. And while the majority leader has additional power, more power than other members of the Senate, his toolbox is significantly smaller than the Speaker of the House when it comes to organizing and streamlining what will happen in his or her chamber. So parties matter more in the House than they do in the Senate. Now that might seem strange for people who watch what happens in the House and the Senate, because both places are very polarized. And we've got very conservative Republicans in the Senate and relatively liberal Democrats in the Senate. Same is true in the House. But because of the way that things are loosey-goosey and anarchic and Wild West-like in the Senate, there's more opportunities for striking these deals. And we see a little bit more bipartisanship in the Senate as a result. In the House, the majority, because they've got everything locked down, they don't need the minority. So they don't reach out, and it's less bipartisan. Overall, these procedures set the stage for what we're going to talk about next week, which is how these two chambers that are very different end up resolving those differences to try and move forward on legislation. And more recently, how they fail to resolve those differences to try and create legislation and create policies that will allow the country to move forward and make progress on problems that most Americans face. Those differences are certainly built in, and it's clear from the Federalist Papers, at least, that they were willing to give lip service to this idea these different institutions were meant to check and balance one another. But it can also create problems of gridlock in the American Congress. We're going to talk a little bit about that next time. I'm really grateful that you were here with me today. I hope you're all getting sleep and not losing too much of your hair when it comes to the election. Hang in there. We're getting close to the end of the semester. Thanks for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you next time.